So it's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce um, my friend here, Dr. Scott Wilson, who describes himself in his biography as having spent the last 3 decades exploring the intersections between several practices, often contradictory practices. Scott works with instrumental music, vocal music composition, but also with field recordings, immersive multi-channel electroacoustic systems, sounds and visuals. He explores cross-cultural collaborations, live coding and improvisation, often bridging the boundaries between the acceptable and the experimental. He is also the director of BEAST, the Birmingham Electroacoustic Theatre and Studios, and teaches at the same University of Birmingham, which myself and my colleague Anotai had the great privilege to visit last year. And today, Scott is going to talk about his and others' experience of online performances during the recent and ongoing lockdown. So welcome, Scott. How are you doing this morning? Thank you for joining us at such an early time. Did you have a nice breakfast?
Yes, I did. Yes, I'm okay. I think I'm awake now. Thank you for thank you for the introduction. There should be a special word for the embarrassment that one feels when one reads one's bio read. Here's one's bio read aloud. I don't think that's meant to happen somehow.
That's not what I did. That's what I did. I misinterpreted it.
Okay, but yes, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you for the invitation. It's I mean, it's really fascinating watching some of these events. You know, I was sort of just mentioning in the Q&A that, you know, in some ways it feels like the problems are not so similar if I want to play with, you know, my friend Eric Nystrom, who lives about a block away from me, or play with somebody in Bangkok. You know, obviously there's some audio latency, but there's something, as difficult as the pandemic has been, there's been this kind of weird leveling thing where it feels like you guys aren't so much farther from, you know, than the people across the street, because we have to engage in similar kinds of ways.
That's true, and it certainly felt that way last night when we rehearsed.
Yes,
with Jake from London. It really felt like, well, you know, we couldn't do a high five at the end, but that was pretty much the only difference.
I think Zoom has a button for that, I think.
Oh, it's coming. It's coming. Yes.
Yes, it's definitely coming. Anyway, I should probably get started here, I suppose. So after that, after Ivan's very polished and formal presentation, I'm going to speak fairly informally about these matters. So I'm just going to see if I can successfully share my screen here. I have to make sure that I'm doing this the right way. Okay, I think this should work. Let's see how it goes. Can everybody see that? They should see a slide now, yeah?
Yes, it's totally fine.
Okay. So yes, as JD mentioned, I was asked to speak about my experiences of, you know, like so many of us, suddenly finding myself in the position of having to figure out ways to make music with other people online, and from a distance, and using you know, technologies which for many people are unfamiliar, in many cases are not really designed for the purposes that we're putting them to. I mean, that's in some ways, I think, something that a lot of people from, you know, who are from my kind of background, who are interested in experimental music of various sorts, experimental electronic, we're used to misusing tools, but you know, this somehow felt a little bit different in some ways. And my first thought when I was asked to do this was that, you know, I'm not such an expert on this, but I suppose in some ways I'm, you know, as much as an expert as many people who've been sort of thrown into the deep end, so to speak, about this on rather short notice. You know, there's been lots of people sort of struggling to deal with this. We, as JD mentioned, run an annual festival with BEAST, with our big, which is a big loudspeaker system for presenting electronic music. It was really lovely to have JD and Anotai come in and present at that. last year, but this year we'd actually canceled it, and then we decided to bring it online, and there was this whole kind of rush to figure out how we're going to do that. How do you do an online conference? What are the trade-offs of that? And in the end, it was quite a wonderful thing to do. I thought it was really wonderful how it brought everybody together at a time when I think people really needed to be brought together. It was really lovely. Some sort of strange things came up. People were, because there was a streaming platform for the concerts, and then there were comments. You could comment while it was streaming. So it was actually like, an etiquette thing. Normally you would never chat to somebody in a concert, right? Because that would be rude to talk over the concert. You might whisper in somebody's ear, but you wouldn't actually talk in a way that others could hear. But this was somehow, this kind of etiquette emerged where that was acceptable. So you had this kind of stream of positive feedback coming, which I think probably, sort of suppressed the normal composer tendency to be a bit catty about people's pieces and things like this, because there was just this kind of rush of goodwill. And we actually decided at the end of it, I think, even if in the future we're able to do in-person events again, which I assume we will be, I hope we will be, but we think we'll probably try to stream and do them online at the same time, because there's really nothing to lose and a lot to gain. And I think one of the nice things about this situation is that people are finding these things to take away from this experience back into, more normal times, or whatever becomes normal after this, because we're still working that out, of course. So I'm going to, so the name of the talk is Distant Soundings, which is also the name of the performance we're going to do on Friday. So what are the issues with doing this? So I tried to think about just a kind of informal rundown of some of the problems with trying to play music with people online. How do we actually do this? What are the things that come up? So I'll start from a personal perspective. I do have expertise with what's sometimes called network music, but my experience with network music is very much to do with local networks. So we're not. In most of the things that I've done, I haven't been dealing with somebody in Shanghai. I've been dealing with somebody who's in the same room with me. And in many cases, we might actually be connected by a physical cable, without, much more than a network switch between us or something like this. Which is, I think sometimes people sort of forget these distinctions between local area networks and wide area networks. But there can be a lot of difference in terms of the practicalities and how you approach that. And the local area networks, of course, have a lot of very practical application, and you can do a lot of interesting things with them. But they avoid some of the problems. So I've done a lot of work with. We have a laptop ensemble. So this is for people who aren't kind of in this world. We have a group of performers, and we play together on laptops. And this group is called the Birmingham Ensemble for Electroacoustic Research. And we've really, our whole thing is working with network systems as kind of structural interventions. So we use a local network to create a kind of structure for improvisation, and to allow, if you look at like a lot of improvised music past the sort of free jazz period, a lot of that has to do with how do you impose structures in improvised music? How do you create things like quick changes, quick coordinations, while still maintaining elements of freedom? And so you see people like John Zorn creating game pieces, or you see people like Anthony Braxton creating systems which are kind of like toolkits for creating performances. So we're sort of doing that, but doing it with computer network systems, which are, sort of like, I think as far as that kind of intervention mechanisms go, is really the kind of mechanism par excellence. And so we've done a lot of that, but again, often with people, for the most part, in the same room. I had, however, watched with interest various developments in telematic performance, including in particular in Birmingham, the various editions of the Network Music Festival, which was a festival which was actually started by some former students at Birmingham, Shelley Knotts and Les Hutchins. And it was really a festival about network music in all of its manifestations. And the first two editions of that took place in Birmingham. It's actually just the third one has just happened this year after a gap of some years, and it was actually the first time it was all online, which was really nice. But the first ones were in person, and it had a variety of different things going on. We had, crazy different things. We had, things that were like video game pieces, like taking that kind of experience of almost like games again. We had sort of comedy pieces involving Skype. We had more serious things. And we had actually, interestingly, for one of the early editions, the featured guests were the Hub Ensemble. And some of you may have heard of the Hub. They were a kind of a proto-network, well, still are actually a kind of proto-network music group. I think they were a network music group without even knowing they were a network music group. It started in San Francisco. There's some really nice documentation online about this, which I can send to anybody if they're interested. But they're a wonderful group of people, really interesting guys, and they came and they did a talk at the university, which we hosted, and they talked a lot about their experience of doing these network pieces, from the early days when they were really like, physically wiring things up themselves, sort of all the way through to what they do now. But one of the things they talked about a lot was that they really had to shake off this idea that people had that they were a telematic group which was doing stuff at a distance. And they almost never did this. And they really, really hated it because they found it so difficult and so unreliable and so flaky. And you can imagine what it must have been like in those days. And in fact, they were sort of talked into doing a telematic performance once. It was such a miserable experience that they actually, the group kind of broke up for a while after this. So that, if these people are having this kind of struggle with it, albeit with earlier, less reliable technology, you can understand the kind of level of problems that you might be facing with this. Nevertheless, for every problem, there is an opportunity, and I think it's often interesting. Yvonne talked, I think, quite eloquently about the possibilities that these situations offer you, and how do you kind of make things that work in the situation? How do you exploit these things? And there's lots of pieces out there which really make a virtue out of the problems with telematic presentation. An interesting one might be, is Global String by Atao Tanaka and Kasper Toplitz, which is basically, it's actually a kind of multi-location sound installation where you have a physical string. It's a big wire which people can interact with, and it's connected over the internet between locations. And basically the delay that you have in the audio traveling between those locations is effectively sonified. And it becomes kind of part of the piece. And there's been a lot of pieces that do things like that. So we take something like network latency and we use it as a feedback loop. We use it as if it was a delay line. So and a delay line is just something where you've got sound goes in and comes out a little bit later, and you can feed the output back into the input and actually make something that's a bit like a model of what a resonating string sounds like. So they were using the internet itself as a kind of resonating string. And then all the kind of variation in that becomes part of the piece too, which is a really beautiful idea. And it is actually a very beautiful, beautiful piece. Much of this work, however, remains quite experimental. And some of these works are interesting in essence because they don't work, or in terms of how they don't work. And I think that's a really interesting category to put works of art into, that there's something about the not normalness of them or the problems that they have that makes them interesting. Years ago, I was an artist in residence at the Center for Art and Media in Karlsruhe in Germany, ZKM. And they had a lot of pieces in their museum there, which are sort of like fake people. They're simulating humans somehow. And I thought, it struck me at some point that these pieces are interesting because they don't work. They're failures in some way. And lots of these pieces which are about the sonifying the internet, for instance, are interesting because the latency is bad. And ironically, if we solve these problems, some of those kind of virtues might go away, which is just an observation, but something interesting to think about of what makes us engage with things, or sometimes the imperfection is rather than how well it works. We were also, we have at the University of Birmingham a telepresence suite with very good internet connection. We're connected directly to the internet backbone in the UK, and they had actually tried to convince us to do chamber music concerts with people in Scotland, and I was thinking, and they were saying, yeah, we can get the latency down low enough that it will work. And I actually thought to myself, well, why is that interesting? I mean, that's just slightly less interesting, isn't it? Once the novelty wears off, it's slightly less interesting than playing with people in the same room, because in the end, you've just achieved the same thing. You've got a string quartet which can play together. Okay, oops. The door blew closed, apologies for that. Right, so music is a special case in telematic connection. That's something that's worth thinking about as well. It's not what people are normally doing with telematic software. Music needs low latency, at least if you have a kind of traditional idea of music of instrumentalists performing together. So we probably need below 30 milliseconds of latency, which is quite low, can be hard to achieve. So so basically I'm sending sound out to you and you sending sound back to me. And in perceptual psychology, people talk about the perceptual now. What's the period of time that we perceive as being now? And that's really relevant for music because we have to think about what it means if we're playing together, right? So it needs to work in both ways. We need to be able, I'm sending sound to you, you're sending sound to me, possibly we're sending it to other people, and we need to have that short enough that it feels like we're together in now. We also need really low jitter in terms of that latency. That latency should not vary a lot. And one of the things that we know, just from traditional music and other contexts, is that we can actually cope with latency, but it's a lot harder to cope with it if it's variable. I mean, a classic example from the instrumental music world is some organs which exist in very large spaces, perhaps have some banks of pipes which are a bit at a distance, things like this. So there can be an audible delay, or the manuals are in a funny place, so there can be an audible delay between playing and hearing. Organists get quite good at coping with that. And they can even, follow a conductor and try and be in sync. I used to conduct graduation ceremonies at the university in Birmingham, and there was a brass band and an organ, and there were fanfare trumpets at the back. And yeah, I mean, it was a little bit tricky, but even though there was the fanfare trumpets were far enough away to have a delay, we could kind of keep it together so that the sound was roughly synced up in the middle. So you can do that, but if it's changing all the time, it's hard. So often what software does, at least stuff that's trying to deal with this in a way for music, is it makes the latency large enough that the jitter is minimized, but that tends to push the latency up because we don't want it kind of shifting. We probably, for telematic connection with music, we need simultaneous high quality bidirectional audio and video. And this has a lot of bearing on what kind of connections you have, where you're playing from, what kind of software you're using, this kind of stuff. And often with the kind of software that we're using, for instance, Zoom, which we're using today, has all sorts of noise suppression algorithms, audio compression. It's optimized for voices. It isn't designed to let 5 people send sound to each other at once. It's designed to let one person talk and have one person. Oh, is there a problem? Can you hear me? Yeah. You still there?
It's still fine. There was a little bit of granular delay for a second. It was quite nice.
That was a
Please,
demonstration of what I'm
yes,
talking
yes.
about.
Please do it again.
Yeah. Okay, it probably just means I'm talking too loud, so I'll turn myself down a little bit. If I have to, I'll get headphones. So these kind of things can interfere with a good kind of experience in terms of music. Um, so, and you know, the other problem is that musicians, by and large, even computer musicians, aren't network experts. And sometimes, you know, you can do things in terms of kind of specialized approaches and fine tuning of systems and things. You know, but most people I know who are computer musicians probably, you know, would need somebody to hold their hand a little bit to go through to adjusting their router settings, you know, for example, on their home internet connection. And I've had to do quite a lot of this with people recently. So that's, you know, yeah, that's an issue as well. Right, so specifically looking at this, if we're dealing with local internet connections, say in your house or something, you've possibly got problems with relatively low bandwidth and quality of service, particularly low upward bandwidth. So your home internet tends to be set up to give you maximum download bandwidth and not very much upload bandwidth. And this makes a lot of sense when you think about it, because your home internet is mostly for people watching Netflix or whatever they're watching. So there's a lot of stuff coming in. But up until, you know, the crisis, there was relatively less stuff going out from your home. You know, it was more like requests for the show from Netflix or something like that, which is a lot lower bandwidth than the occasional Skype or Zoom call. Now there's more, of course, because people are having all these meetings, but that tends to be still kind of strangled a little bit. And if you look at your internet service provider, they'll probably say that the bandwidth they give you is quite a lot larger for download than upload. But of course, when we're trying to play together musically, we need bandwidth in both directions. Wireless connections are the default, but less than ideal. Wi-Fi adds a lot of latency. It adds a lot of unreliability to things. Most routers, of course, you can actually physically plug an Ethernet cable into and connect wired, but a lot of people don't know how to do that on their router. So, you know, you have to kind of talk people through that. And then the other thing that can be a bit of a problem with trying to connect to other people is what's called network address translation, or NAT. And I'll just briefly talk about what that is, because I'm sure a lot of people don't know. So basically, this translates between the wide area network, the internet, and the local area network behind your router, and those will have different address ranges. So basically, you have an address on your router has an address on the internet, and all the computers behind the router in your house or your phone or whatever have local addresses. And any computer on the internet can only basically directly see your router. So when you send a message out, you send a message to the router translates that into a message for the internet, the reply comes back, and it knows to send the reply to the device that requested that. This provides a measure of security by blocking unsolicited incoming connections, which is great for security, but it's not so good, for instance, if I want to stream music to you, because it's much better if I can connect directly to your computer and send information directly between the two rather than via some server, because that adds more latency. Latency, maybe I glossed over that too quickly. Latency basically means time. It takes time for the sound of the data to travel back and forth. So it makes it harder to connect, you know, what people call peer-to-peer connections. And you can improve this situation with something called port forwarding, or a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, which basically means that you configure one computer or device on your local area network to receive certain messages or to receive all unsolicited incoming messages, but that requires some expertise to set up. It's a little bit different in every router. And again, most musicians, even computer musicians, aren't used to like tweaking their router settings a lot. So that requires some expertise. Institutional connections. So if you're lucky enough to work at a university, particularly in a place like the UK, where a lot of, certainly the older institutions are really directly on the country's internet backbone, you can have a very, very fast connection. So we're hoping on Friday that when we do the concert that I'll be able to be on campus and plug in directly there as I was yesterday. I couldn't be there today because the building is closed. We have early opening for some people, after the lockdown, but there's a rumor that Birmingham may be locked down again. So fingers crossed that we won't be locked down on Friday. So when you're in an institutional connection, you can get a fast connection. And it probably can be wired, although maybe only for staff. Usually if you have a computer in your office, you can plug into the wall, but not necessarily any student can just plug into any internet port, at least without arranging that. Again, often directly on the internet with a public address range, which means no NAT, which is really nice because it means JD can type in the address of my computer in my office and send a message directly there. And assuming there's no firewall or anything else blocking it, my computer can just go, yep, got your message, sorted. That's good. However, this does present access issues, both general ones, which is something that, of course, we should always be concerned about when we think about how we approach these things. Not everybody works in an institution. Not everybody is a member of staff there. Not everybody is lucky enough to have those connections. So it's not a general solution for everyone. And then also COVID-related issues, which a couple of the people who are going to be performing on Friday with us do have institutional affiliations. One of them can't go in because he's been banned because he's been considered high risk. So he's not allowed to go on campus at all this semester coming up. And another one, her campus is closed, so she can't go there, and she's trying to get her home internet upgraded. So yeah, we have this presents these problems as well. And then another sort of issue is that the priorities for commercial software developers can conflict with these requirements for music. We often end up using software like Zoom or something that's not optimized for music applications. And even now, uses like large meetings have only received special attention relatively recently. I remember trying to do conference calls with 3 or 4 people on Skype a couple of years ago, and it was horrible. Even with a fast interconnection, it was unreliable, it was flaky. But just this year, we had online graduation drinks with our students. We had about 40, 50 people on the Zoom meeting, and I sat with Wi-Fi in my garden and a glass of champagne, and it worked. And I think that's actually quite astonishing. We had 40 little video screens, and by and large, it worked. But that's obviously become a lot more important now, than it was recently. And music applications are only now coming onto the agenda for companies with the necessary resources. So one of the things is to do this really well, you probably need, lots of servers, lots of bandwidth, really good connections, lots of tech, lots of optimization, and that takes resources. That's hard for you to do in your bedroom. But Zoom can do that. And I just saw recently that Zoom has finally grokked that people are trying to use this for music and for cello lessons and things like this. So they're actually going to try to accommodate this. And they're saying that they are going to, improve the audio quality, in ways that there are already some ways to improve the audio quality in Zoom. But they're going to, try to make it a bit better, allow people to actually play together. So have 4 or 5 people sending sound at the same time, which is something that you can't really do very well in Zoom right now. Right, so I'll just check the time here. Okay, we're doing all right. So I've got a few case studies, which are sort of the meat of this, which are really back to sort of personal things and what have I actually done with this since the pandemic really hit us. So the first one is the Super Colliding Super Club. Which was, so we got into lockdown, and I kind of realized that, I had a lot of doctoral students and people who lived by themselves in some cases, who were isolated. People weren't going out very much because we were really in the early days was in a quite tight lockdown. So I really wanted to think about, well, what can we do to kind of keep people connected? And we suddenly became really aware that this idea, this kind of community aspects, these social things were really, really important now for people's mental health, for feeling connected. And so I started to think, how can we make a kind of online coding group? So I work a lot with this language called Super Collider, which is a music programming language. And how can we make a group for this as a kind of social, educational activity, educational, but also social? And I had some problems with this because, you know, I have all of this local network experience, but most of the approaches we used to making pieces together were impractical here for some of the reasons that I've just mentioned. I needed this to be workable for non-network specialists. We'd meet for about an hour and a half every Thursday or every second Thursday, depending on how we felt about it. You know, and I couldn't spend 40 minutes of that debugging people's network setups. We needed something that was, you know, relatively easy to get going. And yeah, and as I said, I wanted to create a context to overcome this sense of isolation, allow us to share and make music together online. I just feel like we're still a community, we're still a group, we're still together. I had the advantage in this situation that it was relatively low risk and undemanding in terms of quality. It wasn't a public performance; it was us kind of playing around together. So we had, you know, we had space really to try a lot of different things, and it didn't have to be fantastic. And if it failed, we could just take some notes and move on, try something else. So we experimented with a variety of approaches. We tried Zoom initially, and this is where we learned some of the things about what you could do with Zoom and audio sharing and whatnot. It's not so good for music as only one audio share at a time. It's okay for messing about. So, you know, you could show people things and share your audio to them, show them what you've been working on. You could try some things out, you could demo things. And we did actually try to do some performances just with microphones and picking up the speakers, and, you know, the kind of, there's this sort of this noise suppression and the speaker highlighting and all this stuff that goes on in Zoom. And it was a little bit flaky, but it kind of worked and it was sort of fun. We tried something called Jamulus, which is a kind of a music specific app, and it's actually kind of really designed to allow people to kind of get together and, you know, play blues tunes or something on the internet. And it's a little bit rough and ready, but it was really nice. You could run your own server, so we thought that was sort of cool. We could run a Jamulus server on one of the computers at the university, which are again on the internet backbone, so that was good. No firewalls and no NAT or discovery problems, and we could you know, do that. So that was sort of nice. We tried Ken Field's thing, Arts Mesh, which is a kind of all singing and dancing thing, which tries to bring together video streaming and chat and OSC sharing, and which is a kind of data sharing thing, and Jack Tripp for audio. And but we'd used Jack Tripp before for a kind of sonified network piece, which we've done with the Laptop Ensemble, and it's diabolical really to configure and set up, particularly with multiple people playing. So we found that not really practical for people who were not experts. Although it's nice all of the things that wraps up together. And then Jam Kazam, which is again another kind of audio streaming platform, which is relatively easy for non-specialist users, has reasonably good performance in terms of latency, and has some chat and video and other things built into it as well. So that seemed to be the best approach for playing together that we found. So the second case study is our performance that we did of with the Laptop Ensemble of our piece Dark Matter at the NIME conference this year. I'll just say a little bit about what that project is. So it's a collaboration with the Art at CMS project at CERN. So CERN is the European Atomic Physics Research Center. CMS is one of the big experiments there, and they have an art project. So they do lots of art that's to do with particle physics. And we were sonifying and visualizing data from the Large Hadron Collider, which is the world's largest particle accelerator. So we took that data, and using Super Collider, we were converting that into sound and also with some other software into visualizations of the data, and using that as kind of source material to improvise. And we use what's called live coding, which is programming music using algorithms that can be rewritten while they're running. So we have an algorithm which is taking the data, turning it into sound, and then you can rewrite that data while it's running. rewrite that algorithm while it's running. I'm not going to say too much more about that because that's a whole other topic, but that's basically the project in a nutshell. So the problem was, how do we adapt this existing piece for a a suddenly, unexpectedly online conference? So NIME, like our festival, suddenly had to move online. Ironically, it was supposed to be in Birmingham, so I was looking forward to being able to go to a conference that I wasn't running and be able to still sleep in my own bed. But as it happened, I couldn't actually go. So we had to figure out how to do this. This included two things. One was a kind of pre-recorded performance, and then also we did a live stream. So we needed, we had the performers who were, two of us were in Birmingham. One was not too far from Birmingham. One was in Hong Kong. One was in Turkey. So we had to figure out how to kind of get these multiple audio streams together from diverse locations. We're improvising together, so we need to hear what each other are doing. So we have these issues of sync, so everybody needs to more or less hear the same thing. Latency is a bit of an issue, although less of an issue than in the kind of string quartet thing, because we're not adjusting our timing with each other in that way, so we can cope with a little bit of latency. It needed to be easy to configure, and we needed to be able to discover each other's computers and connect across NAT, which is a problem. Again, I can't just send a message out to your computer behind the router and say, connect to me, because the router will say, I didn't ask for this, go away. And if we're both behind NAT, it's hard to connect. And we needed to be able to debug this all somehow and get it working. So we ultimately used a kind of centralized approach where audio and video were synthesized in one location only, which was actually on my computer in my house. This solved a lot of problems in terms of it was synthesized in one place, so it got the sync problem. Everybody would hear the same thing. The latency varied, but basically it was the same thing, even if it was a little bit later or earlier here and there. And this worked in the end, but it was somewhat fragile. And a bit hard to set up, and had a lot of elements. And I've got, we had enough text for a while, so here's a graph of what this actually looked like. So on the left there, you can see we've got these computers with Super Collider, and they're sending open sound control, which is just a form of data sending. So they're basically sending information about, they're not sending audio, they're sending information about what to synthesize. And I had on my computer, which is in the middle here, I had an instance of Super Collider. So they're all connected to my instance of Super Collider and telling it what to synthesize. We also had processing, which was doing the visualizations. And then that connected to OBS. This would be for the live streaming version, which then went out to YouTube. So that's quite complicated. And you can see here that these guys are all behind NAT. I'd set my computer up as a DMZ, so I was the only one who had to basically mess with my router settings, which I'm comfortable doing, but the other people probably wouldn't have been. So that made that easier. And it worked such that because the networking system that we developed for our local area networking work sort of pings people back and forth, that was, once they made the initial connection, that was fine. There was no problem with keeping connected. Unfortunately, they also needed to hear what they were doing, and so we needed to stream that back somehow. And the way we ended up doing that was by running Zoom, and I shared my audio to them. And so I was the only one sharing audio, so that works. So they actually listened to themselves back over Zoom, and then we also had Zoom for screen sharing and debugging and chatting if we needed to. And this basically, as I said, it worked. But we had also a lot of dependent other technologies, again, open sound control, Siphon for sending video between apps, and Black Hole as a kind of intermediate audio driver. So there's a lot of things that needed to be set up for this to work. And you can just see here a little bit of the live stream. You can probably hear it a bit. And you can see that there are some problems with the video glitching. The audio actually was smooth for the most part in the live stream, but the video glitches. And it worked fine when we tested it during the day, but the performance was in the evening and everybody was watching movies on Netflix in my neighborhood. So I think it just was a little bit higher bandwidth, and that was hard to predict. Okay, so that brings me on to Distant Soundings, which is the performance we're going to do on Friday. And for this one, we were thinking, well, how can we be more pragmatic? How can we really work with the situation that we have? So we invited a number of people from, there's a couple of us in Birmingham, there's somebody in London, somebody in Bogota in Colombia, and somebody in Falmouth, also in the UK, and invited them to be involved in this performance. Decided to make it a kind of collaborative improvisation made from field recordings in our localities and around the world. So, starting out with bringing stuff from where we are to this performance and combining them into an improvisation together, and then broadening out to sounds from other places that we've been in, other recordings that we had, which seemed like a nice kind of thing to do under the circumstances, and somehow, again, reaching across this kind of physical isolation that we have. The nice thing is that only loose coordination is required, so there's no real issues with latency or jitter. We're not trying to beat match, we're not trying to play together, we're kind of layering and combining and making textures. So if it's a little bit in and out, it doesn't really matter so much. JD is doing some visuals to go with this. So he's gathering together the audio streams in Bangkok. And then he's doing some visuals, which are mostly non-real time. I think we decided yesterday that there may be some real-time things going on. We're going to maybe take some webcam images and stuff, but mostly I think he's going to be using materials, visuals, text, videos, and things from places where we've recorded that we've sent him in advance. So that's easy and reliable. And we use Jam-Kazam, again, for the relatively easy setup and connection. You can mostly just go to people and say, install this app. And, if they're reasonably computer savvy with very little bit of configuration, you can kind of get it working. And Jam-Kazam sort of gets everybody connected and deals with, you can still improve performance in that by sort of dealing with NAT and this sort of stuff. But Jam-Kazam sort of, you don't have to do that. And Jam-Kazam gets everybody connected without doing that. So this is what it looks like. So we've got performers sending audio and webcam images on the left via Jam-Kazam. In the middle there is JD. And he's got Arena for his video and going into OBS out to YouTube. And again, we've got Zoom just for debugging and chatting and feeling like we're actually looking at each other and talking to each other, which I've come to realize is kind of important. But that's more just as a backup. And so this is, compared to the other setup, is relatively easy to do. Most of the participants are only communicating via, Jam-Kazam and possibly Zoom. Zoom they know pretty well, so Jam-Kazam's not too hard. The video and other stuff is handled only locally, so again, that makes it a bit easier to deal with. Right, I am more or less on time, much to my amazement. So neither under or only 1 minute over, I think. So yeah, thank you to everybody at PGVIM for doing this. It's really wonderful to have this event and to be able to share about these experiences. And it's been really a pleasure and an honor to be asked to talk about this stuff. There's a few links there if you're interested, but basically that's my talk. So I don't know if there's any questions, but yeah.
Thank you very much, Scott. I'm very impressed to see you so alert so early in the morning. You'll have to share your secret with me.
I live with the 12-year-old girl as my.
Okay, and at the moment I'm also we are trying to get Joe Hyde in the panel. I understand that there's a little bit of a problem getting the links to him. So I'm actually communicating on the side to make sure we can get Joe in as a panelist soon. Ivan has just reappeared as well.
I was always there. In fact, I
knew you were, but visually at least.
Visually, yes. Thank you very much, Scott. You really covered so many facets and interesting facets of network music and addressed a lot of the issues. I liked the concept of the perceptual now. I wonder how humans can actually, how far they can extend that perceptual now, because that's a dimension musically that's quite important. But I also like your term diabolical to describe jack trip configurations, because I've been through that and it is quite diabolical, I agree.
I was one of my disappointments, I haven't said this to Ken, but one of my disappointments with ArtsMesh is that it didn't just sort that out for you. And I kind of, you know, we do this piece called Peace Stew, which is kind of a network version of Nick Collins' old Peace Soup, which is a feedback piece. So we basically connect everybody to everybody else on a local network and then seed the network with some sound and stream audio to each other and sonify that. And we use Jack Trip for that. And I had to write code to auto-configure it. Otherwise, it would just take, you know, getting everybody set up would take 40 minutes every time we did the piece. So it's kind of, yeah, I mean, it just feels to me, it's one of those things, I mean, it's a general thing I feel is, why is networking so hard? Why is this stuff so hard in the 21st century? They should be solved already, really.
But I upgraded my operating system on my laptop, and then Jack Trip doesn't work on it anymore. So
oh yes, that's another problem. This kind of it's the academic software problem, isn't it? Somebody makes something, they get it to work, they you know, they publish the paper, and then but nobody, you know, I mean, I've written software too that I've put out there, and then nobody wants to maintain their software. Maintenance is suffering, really, isn't it? So.
Yeah, it is. I have a question. Are you familiar with port forwarding websites at all, where you can sort of reroute an open port of that you need, for example, for ArtsMesh? You need port 4464 or something open for connection for the sound. Now, normally you can open that on your modem with a special thing, but there's also websites available. And I discovered one, there's a few, but for example, there's websites in India where they do port forwarding, but that adds an extra latency, I assume.
Yeah, well, there used to be this thing called OSC groups, which somebody wrote, which basically was to solve this NAT problem. And you know, it was, so you're connecting to a website, and then, you know, so you can always connect to a website because that's directly on the internet. You know, then it would do all the kind of translation. But of course, it does add latency. And, you know, I think there was the guy who created it, was it Ross Bensina? I think he was running a server, which he, you know, which might have been in his basement or something. I remember there was one for Extramuros, which was a kind of code duplication website that my friend David Ogburn ran, which was in his basement. It was an old Windows machine, and he finally shut it down. So I think, you know, that's kind of a problem too. I mean, I found in the end, like when we did the thing with Nine, what was easier for me was just to, as long as one person knows how to set up a machine as, you know, as a DMZ or something, or has a connection on the internet, you know, or has an institutional machine or something that's directly on the internet, then you usually can solve these problems. I was going to mention about your perceptual now question. There's a really nice paper, which I can find the link for, by Gary Kendall, where he talks about this issue actually, specifically in reference to electroacoustic music and bringing in kind of, you know, developments over the last 20 years in perceptual psychology, which I think is just excellent. And really, you know, goes to town on how surprising it is that none of the theory about this stuff has really embraced this kind of information. Hello, Joe. I can see Joe.
Yes. Hi, Joe. Stefan is here as well.
Oh, hello, Stefan. So I don't know if there's any other, there don't seem to be any questions on the question list, but I don't know if anybody else has any other questions.
We have another 13 minutes.
Yeah.
Actually, I wanted to test the sound. Joe, you were sounding a little bit granulated.
Am I still granulated now?
Oh, slightly.
Okay, I'll try switching to a different. I was trying to use an external microphone, but I'll not. See if that helps.
Static.
Thank you. It's now is a good time to demonstrate the issues we've been discussing for the last hour.
Does that sound better?
Oh, that's better. Or at least it's a matter of taste. We should all vote.
Yeah. I'm using my fancy Fireface interface, and obviously the built-in mic is better.
Oh, forget fancy stuff. It's overrated.
I think with this stuff, better is better for the moment, you know.
Exactly, yeah.
Well. Yeah.
I had a hunch it might do something strange.
Are you well, Joe, wherever you are?
I am, yes. Yeah, it's a bit early in the morning for me still, but I have just made a coffee. So.
Oh yes, I confess, Ivan, I was eating my breakfast during your talk, which actually was quite a nice thing to do. I enjoyed that, I have to say. Because more conferences should have breakfast sessions. You know, I think that's kind of.
Maybe that's going to be a new thing now. We will all be meeting at different times, and I'm wondering.
But I guess with online events, it's always breakfast somewhere, isn't it? So it's also always
absolutely
cocktail hour somewhere. So
it's actually dinner time here. So
you can just, I mean, I guess you could just do whatever you want and just tell people you're somewhere else if that looks inappropriate or something. So.
Yeah.
I'm trying to find out if we have any questions from our guests, from our attendees here. Ivan, you were mentioning that, you just mentioned that network performance is still such in its infancy. And listening to Scott talking, I was kind of wondering if in 100 years we'll be looking at what we are doing now in the same way as we are now looking at the telegraph and Morse code. And where do you think this is all going? How fast do you think this technology will evolve now, especially with the increasing demand that we are now facing or encountering? That's a question for you, Scott.
Well, I guess it's been interesting from my perspective. It's been interesting to see, you know, the situation has definitely focused a lot of attention on this, and I think, you know, there certainly was attention on video conferencing before, but there's been a lot of attention on that, and it's been amazing. I mean, just watching how much better these things have gotten. I mean, from my personal anecdotal experience, I think Zoom's performance, for example, has improved quite a lot over the months, and I think they probably realized, oh my God, we've got an opportunity here. They've invested a lot in infrastructure for this and actually put a lot of money into improving things. And the music thing has come along too, in that sense. So I think that people are, you know, so Jam Kazam is, you know, which we're using, they just had an update. As I said, Zoom has realized that a lot of people are using this for music lessons now. I think people are also realizing these things as not just business tools, but social, but are important for social interactions in this situation, which, you know, has different requirements than just having a meeting. So I think there is a tension going into those things, and I think also people are, you know, as I said, people will take things away from this experience. You know, we've ended up having, you know, Zoom drinks with friends all over the world, and we keep saying, like, why aren't we doing this all the time? It feels like they're far away, but now it feels like, you know, if I want to have drinks with people across the street, I'm probably doing that on Zoom as well, you know, so it's kind of, it's sort of equalizing. So I think, you know, there'll be payoffs in terms of this stuff. The long-term thing of it, I mean, I don't know. I mean, again, there's this kind of experimental aspect of this, you know, which is exploiting some of the limitations of it. And, you know, and I love stuff like that, and that's very interesting. But whether there will be kind of mainstream, broadly present cultural forms of online musical interaction, which you know, continue past the pandemic, and grow out of this stuff, or grow out of the developments of new technologies, I think that remains to be seen. The one exception I would say is I think music lessons online are here to stay. That's been, you know, that's now been proven to be acceptable, and it more or less works, mostly at the moment, because you don't necessarily have to play together all the time. But I think that will be something that people will keep doing in the same way that people will keep working from home. You know, I think that's become that's been proven now, the kind of the lingering kind of social taboos about that, that if you're working from home, you're really being lazy or something. I think those are gone now. So I suspect after the pandemic that we'll still see music lessons online. We'll still see people working. But anyway, I don't know. Maybe other people have other ideas about that and what they think it will be like. Sorry, that was a long answer.
No. It's thank you for sharing what your crystal ball is telling you. I think most of us would agree. I think it's really impressive to see how well this works. Just to be able to do what we are doing right now at our kind of level, just 10 years ago would have been unthinkable, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of lucky in that sense, aren't we, that we can actually do this. It must have been, I was thinking, about the, 1918 pandemic, how different that would have been with no kind of global communication at all, really, or no instantaneous communication like this. And yeah, just in terms of the way people navigated the pandemic itself and the information they received, it would have just been completely different.
Yes, a very different experience. Do you have any other questions coming? If anybody wants to jump in from the participants.
I had a comment more than a question.
Mm-hmm.
In response to the same question as you had, I personally am very interested in how one might focus less on sending audio data and rather sending other data. So that's where I think Scott's presentation of ways of working with live coding remotely are really interesting. And Scott, I realize there's not so much time for you to go to the bottom of this question now. So therefore, I would actually like to start by publicly inviting you to join an event that we're planning in October, a conference on network performance in COVID times, where we will discuss live coding. And we did
lovely. Thank you.
To my PhD students live coding the hyper organ that we have in my school in Piteå. Remotely, and it's also fascinating because then you're live coding a huge mechanical instrument which doesn't have latency. So of course you still have the latency and the audio feedback from the space to where you are, but in live coding, in my understanding, latency isn't always necessarily a problem because processes still take time, right? So I found this really interesting, and it would be great to discuss this further. But maybe
it's funny with live coding because you're often setting an algorithm in motion.
Yeah, exactly.
So your latency isn't. Sometimes people have sort of quantization methods to line things up in terms of beats. Although often when people are doing live coding, particularly telematically, they just tempo match, and they don't. Phase is kind of irrelevant. But you're anyway not doing something necessarily right now, and the way you're thinking is often you're not thinking about what to do now in the way that you would be if you were improvising on a piano. You're thinking about what you're going to do in a minute, because you can do with super heavy inverted commas almost anything, ha ha ha, but you can't necessarily do it quickly. So there's that kind of issue. So I think that's already kind of built into it, but it's yeah, it is interesting, and I've had a number of experiences with live coding. David Ogborn used to have his extramuros thing. He's replaced it with something else, which I have to apologize because the name of it has fallen out of my head. But basically, people could the way it worked was you had a website, and you would pipe there was a little node server, and that would pipe the output of that into whatever coding environment you have. So it could be Tidal or Super Collider or whatever. And so basically everybody's code would execute on everybody's computer, which was was interesting because it sort of meant that you weren't necessarily hearing exactly the same thing, but the bandwidth was very low. So that was good. The bandwidth was low, but it wasn't necessarily happening at exactly the same time. And if you had anything random in your algorithm, of course it was different, but I somehow thought there was something sort of charming about that. And the nicest performance I ever saw of that was actually at the Second Network Music Festival. And it was, and I'd seen a lot of these performances where there was somebody in one room and somebody in Colorado or something like this. But this one there was actually 3 people live coding with extramuros, and none of them were there. There was just some poor tech person at the plinth kind of trying to make sure this all worked. but was really just there to kind of facilitate. And there was this sort of lovely feeling that there were all these people, and one of them was at a swimming lesson with his kid, and one of them was kind of doing this, and something sort of nice about that. Anyway, so this is just anecdotes at this stage.
Exactly. Yeah, there's a lot in there. I also think the possibility of sending just mocap data, for instance, and having visualizations in the other end. This whole possibility, I mean, the range of possibilities when you have a live audience in one venue and send data to that venue. I mean, there are many things. Just again in response.
Yeah. Well, and the general approach of sending some sort of data, ideally peer-to-peer, low bandwidth, small amounts of data. I mean, there's a lot to be said for that, of course, I think, in terms of reliability. But anyway, that's another whole other topic.
Yeah, great. I'll send you an email about the conference.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's obviously a much bigger, there are so many more things to discuss around what you just shared with us, Scott, and we look forward to hearing more about it, probably joining your conference, Stefan, in October. And if you want, if you all want to hear Scott and the Birmingham Collective guests performing distance soundings, join us on Friday, this Friday, that's the 28th of August at 7 p.m. Bangkok time, that's GMT minus